Portsmouth on the Ohio River, which meant that you could get things and send things to any place in the world on that canal. But most of the people here were farmers. So if you were coming to this school this morning, you would be coming from a farm. Now, you know farms are really big, right? They could be 500, 600 football fields, 700 football fields big, because they got to have room to grow food. And in those days, there were not a whole lot of machines. There was no electricity yet. There were no farm vehicles like tractors and combines. All work was done by humans and animals. Now, when you have a farm, you got mom and dad that can do the work, and you got the cows and the oxen and the horses. But who else living on the farm can do the work?
Slaves.
There were no slaves in Ohio. That was against the law.
Kids.
Yes.
Kids.
Kids, the kids. Farmers had usually pretty big families because the children helped on the farm. And I don't mean it like nowadays where you have a few chores to do and maybe you get an allowance. No. You were working on the farm from this time the sun came up till the time the sun went down with a few breaks, okay? So, if you were coming to school today, you would have gotten up in the dark and done your farm chores first. You would have gathered eggs, you would have milked the cows, you would have slopped the hogs, you would have cleaned out a horse stall, that kind of stuff. And then mom would call you for breakfast. You'd have a nice hot breakfast because you're not going to eat again for a while. And then you go to school. So let's think about this. You'd have to get up at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning in the dark, do your chores, have your breakfast, and then walk to school. No school buses yet. And you did not take the family horse to school because you need them on the farm. So, in those days, in the state of Ohio, they wanted a school for every 10-mile radius. That meant the school was supposed to be in the middle, so no child would have to walk any further than 5 miles to school. Has anybody here ever walked 5 miles? How long does it take?
I didn't keep track.
Okay. Well, because I'm old, I keep track. It takes over 2 hours. 2 hours to walk to school. Actually, for students for children your age, you don't walk in straight lines like adults do because you're not in a hurry. So it would take about 2.5 hours because you tend to walk like this all over the place, okay? So that would mean if you got to be here by 9 o'clock, you'd have to leave at 7 o'clock in the morning. And since you're going to fool around, you really should leave about 6:30. So your day probably started at 4:30, and now you're walking to school. 2-hour walk, okay? So then you arrive at school, and in this school you'd be running around in the field here, playing tag, teasing each other, rolling around on the ground, kind of stuff kids do nowadays. They used to do back then. Well, actually now kids will sit on the ground and look at their cell phones, but back then they ran around, and they actually talked to each other. And then I would come out around 9 o'clock. I'm the schoolmaster. You might also have school marm. You might have a lady here teaching, but today you have a man. And that is the bell for school. And you all come running up all excited to be at school, not so much because you like me or the school, but because all your friends are here. And remember, you can't call your friends on your cell phone or the telephone or FaceTime them or Skype them. None of that stuff existed. The only time you saw your friends was at church on Sunday and school was open, okay? And then I would line you up with boys on this side. So let's have the boys line up on this side and girls on this side. I'd separate you because I'm going to treat you differently.
Make a line.
Okay? Because I have very old-fashioned ideas about men and women.
Pretty crooked line.
Make a line. There you
All
go.
right, real good. And part of what I would do before you even came in is I would do something the community wanted me to do, which is to teach you good etiquette. Etiquette's an old-fashioned word we don't use much anymore. Does anybody know what etiquette is? What's?
Hello.
Hello? Well, that's part of good etiquette.
Part of it, yeah.
Okay? We call them manners nowadays. Good manners. Now, back in 1859, manners were very important. You never wanted to hurt anybody's feelings. You always wanted to show respect and be very polite. Sort of getting away from that lately, but it was very important back then. You'd never wear a hat inside of a building, okay, unless you were a lady. And one of the things I would do right off the bat is to remind the boys that their job was to look out for the girls and the women. The boys and the men look out for the girls and the women. Because back then, they didn't understand that women were strong and powerful to take care of themselves. So they thought that the boys would have to take care of the women. Don't really need to do that anymore, right?
No.
Uh-huh.
But still, it's nice. It's nice if boys think that way. So one of the rules that I would remind you of was that the ladies and the girls always come into the room first. The boys and the men follow after that. If there's a door to be opened, the boy opens the door, or the man opens the door, and the lady walks in. It's just being nice. It's just being nice. So that's what we're going to do, and I'm going to have all of the boys sit on this far side of the room and all the girls on this near side of the room. Now, when you would come up, I would greet you. And I would say, "Good morning, scholars." That's what they used to call students, scholars. Is that something? And then you would answer by greeting me by my name. Now, when I'm in this exhibit, I'm Mr. Smiley, just because I'm a nice teacher. Okay. We have another guy that doesn't teach, and he's Mr. Stricter, and he scares the bejeebers out of the kids. I don't like to do that. Okay. So we're gonna try it out. Good morning, scholars.
Good morning, Mr. Smiley.
Glad you're here today. Are you ready to work hard and memorize a lot of things and do a lot of recitation?
Yeah.
No.
I'm so glad to hear that. Okay, well, let's come on in. Now, when I come in, I want you to show me your fingernails. Okay, because cleanliness, as you know, is good etiquette. It's very important. And you're all the children of farmers, so you do a lot of dirty work. And we don't want any dirt under your fingernails. So if you have any dirt under your fingernails, you pull out your little pen knife that you carry around, that little tiny pocket knife, and clean your nails. Okay? And girls, I'm hoping not to see any fingernail paint, because you know, good girls don't wear paint on their fingernails. So if you have any, you scrape it off. Okay, now I'm not going to make you do that, because this is 2019, all right? So, ladies, come right on in, take a seat on one of the benches, face forward. Oh, they're so quiet coming in.
Where's this going here?
This is probably the same way you are at the school you go to, right?
Yes, sir.
Now, if the rule was that you'd be, funny guys, if the rule was that you'd be quiet when you come in, you'd be quiet when you came in. Because back in those days, children were expected to do everything that they were told. If the adult told you to do something, well, you did it. No argument. Okay, very good. So everybody would come into school, and if you look around, does this look anything like your classroom?
No.
Very different. Now, see, this is the way schoolhouses were in most of Ohio, because this is the way they were in Connecticut. When people left Connecticut, this is the picture they had in their head for what a school should look like. So this is called the Connecticut design. And if you notice, there are no chairs or desks. There are just very simple benches with no backs, and that's so that you can face forward or turn around and face backward. You can face the teacher or turn around and face this thing, which was what took the place of the desk. Long tilted shelf all around the room. This is all part of the Connecticut design. Okay? And really old classrooms would not have one of these. This was a big time invention during the 1800s. It's called the blackboard. And do you know when the blackboards first came out, teachers couldn't figure out what they were supposed to do with them? What do you need this thing for? You know? It took them a while to learn. Of course, nowadays you have a what do you call it? A whiteboard?
Starboard.
Smartboard.
Smart boards, thank you, smart boards. I've forgotten what they're called already. You'll also notice that it's kind of dark in here, because there's no electricity yet. So the classroom would be usually equipped with lanterns like this, candle lanterns, or oil lamps that were hung on nails on the wall all the way around. So in the wintertime we can light them, but they don't give off very much light. So it was generally pretty dark in here. And in the wintertime, it was freezing. Freezing cold. So you would be wearing your hat, coats, and gloves all day long in the room, because in this particular schoolhouse, this is the heat source, this fire. And if you look real close, you can see daylight coming down on top of the wood there, because this chimney goes straight up. It goes straight up. And so that means the heat goes straight up. The heat goes out the chimney instead of out to the kids. So the kids would be freezing. Some schools would install, in the wintertime, they'd install a stove, a pot-bellied stove. You'll see that in some of the houses and for sure in the church. And they would burn wood in that stove, and they put it in the middle of the room so the kids could get some heat. And then in the spring, or in the summer, I should say, they took it down and put it away because it was in the way, okay? We would start off the day probably by saying the Lord's Prayer. Now, things were different back then. The Constitution, the First Amendment says that you separate what the state does from what religion does. You don't force anybody to practice a religion or any particular religion. But you see, they didn't pay attention to that back then because everybody was the same. There was no diversity. Everybody was white, Anglo-Saxon, and Protestant. And so if you said a Protestant prayer, nobody cared because you were all Protestant. You know, nowadays things are more diverse. You might have Protestants in the class, or Muslims, or Jews, or Buddhists, and you don't want to force somebody who's a different religion to have to practice your religion, especially if it's a government school. So it was different back then. So we say the Lord's Prayer, and then you guys, every morning, what's something you do together, right in the beginning of the day? Mm-hmm.
Say the Pledge of Allegiance.
The Pledge of Allegiance, yes. Now I know that a lot of people keep reading on the internet that they don't do that anymore, or that they're not allowed to do that anymore. And I'm always making sure to tell the general public that is fake news. Okay, have you ever been in a school where you don't say the Pledge of Allegiance? Neither have I. And I was in education for 40 years, all over the place. So back then though, they would usually, instead of saying the pledge, they would sing a song called My Country 'Tis of Thee. Do you know that song?
Yeah.
Well, just in case you don't, I'm just going to sing a little bit of it, okay? Excuse my voice. My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing, and it goes on and on and on. And then we get started for the day. Now, here's something interesting. In this room, every day, we're probably no more than the number of students I have right now here. It's somewhere between 10 and 30 students. That was all the kids that lived in a 10-mile radius, because there just aren't that many families. They're living on these big, huge farms. So you would be in class with first graders, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, and eighth graders, all in the same room at the same time. Your brothers would be in this room, your sisters would be in this room. So even though the teacher couldn't call your parents if you did something naughty in school, your sister would tell on you, or your brother would tell on you. You'd get in trouble anyhow, okay? So the teacher, obviously, do you think the teacher taught everybody the same thing at the same time?
Probably.
6-year-olds can't even read yet. So the teacher's got to teach them to read. The 8th graders, they can read. In fact, a lot of times the 8th graders would help with the younger students, because the teacher had to be able to meet with all different groups all throughout the day. Have to meet with first graders, have to meet with the second graders separately. Sometimes they might combine the grade levels that are close together. And the teacher would have to teach all these subjects by his or herself to all the different grade levels, including reading, writing, and arithmetic. Now, you know this is writing with a W and arithmetic with an A, but this is just the way that it would say it. Reading, writing, and arithmetic. They'd also learn spelling, grammar, and writing. Now, when I say writing, I mean not just how to write a good paragraph or a good sentence or a good theme or something like that, but how to write letters by hand. They used to teach that, and everybody was expected to use the same style of writing, because in those days, everything was written by hand. The only things that were printed were books. But government documents, the kind of things that the banks have, documents for banks, people used to send letters to each other. And since everything's in writing, it had to be writing that you could read. Can everybody read your writing?
Yes.
Can you read all
No.
their writing?
Not really, no.
Yeah, okay. Now see, I taught school for years, and my wife is a 4th grade teacher, and she brings her stuff home to grade, the writing that they do, and I love to read the writing because It's great, you know? Sometimes it's hilarious. And sometimes I can't read it. I can't read a single word. It looks like a chicken wrote it. You know? And so then my wife goes to school and she asks the student to read it to her so she knows what they wrote. They can't read it either. So you see, that's a problem, isn't it? But fortunately nowadays we have things called computers that we can write on. And once you learn keyboarding, you can write really fast. And everybody can read it. They didn't have those things back then. Not at all. I used to say that, you know, they didn't have computers or typewriters, but you know what a typewriter is. I sold that old technology, okay? So, besides writing and reading and grammar and spelling, also geography, which you sort of learn that as social studies nowadays. Geography is where places are in the world and why they're there and how that affects them. History, which you're learning right now, right? The way things used to be compared to the way they are now. And something called natural philosophy. I know they have science written here, but they called it natural philosophy. And that was the study of nature. The only science that they learned in school was the science of nature. So like biology and botany and things like that. Because nobody could see any reason why the children of farmers would need to know about the stars or chemistry or physics or any of that kind of stuff that you learn about nowadays. So that's what they learned. Now, I always like to tell students about the schedule, when kids went to school, because it's really different. Things have really changed. Since you're the children of farmers, there's 2 times a year when the farm is really, really busy. Can you think of those 2 times a year? Any farmers in here? Probably not, huh? Yes, sir. Spring, planting the seeds, plowing the fields, and what's the other time?
Fall for harvesting.
Harvesting, that's great. So, the kids were needed on the farm so bad, they just wouldn't go to school. They wouldn't go to school in the spring, and they wouldn't go to school in the fall. So right now, it's May, you would not be in school, because Dad would say, they don't need to go do no book learning, they're going to be farmers. I'm teaching them how to farm, so they're staying home. So, you know, the school couldn't argue about that, so they just would close. So that means you would be off in a part of April, May, or actually part of March, April, and May. And then you would go to school in June, July, and August. Oh, no summer vacation. No vacations at all, a lot of work to do. So June, July, and August, you'd be in school. And then in September, October, and part of November, you didn't come to school because you're picking vegetables and fruits and harvesting things and slaughtering animals and that kind of stuff. And then in part of November through till part of December, you'd be in school, and then you'd be off for the holidays. And then you'd be back in January and February and part of March. And then you'd have spring again. So you went to school in the springtime, you went to school in the summertime and the wintertime, and you were off in the spring and the fall. And when you went to school, when school was open, it was open 6 days a week, Monday through Saturday. Okay? Monday through Saturday.
No.
Well, boys and girls didn't know too much different back then, so it was fine with them. They would have had school open on Sunday, except in those days it was against the law to work on Sunday. Why do you think it was against the law to work on Sunday? Yes, sir. Gotta go to church. And the Bible said you shouldn't work on the Sabbath, and what the Bible said was the law. Okay? That's changed. It's separate now. But nobody could work on Sunday, including the teacher, the students, or the farmers. It was a day off. You had to rest. I guess that would be kind of nice, wouldn't it? My wife couldn't say, go out and cut the lawn, because they'd say, well, it's Sunday. I can't work on Sunday. I just have to lay on the couch and watch football. Yes, sir.
Back then, did you have to go to church?
you know, nobody had to force you. Everybody went to church. Now you're thinking, wow, they must have been very pious. Actually, I think people were pretty much the same as they are now, except that if you wanted to see your friends or talk to your friends, you could just walk down the street to see your friend. You could call them on the phone. You could Skype them on the computer. But in those days, you had to go where they all were at once. And on Sunday morning, you know where they all were. They were at church. Okay, so you'd go to the service, the 2-hour service, and the minister would tell you about why you shouldn't gossip about people, how that's a sin. And then afterwards, they'd have fellowship. In the springtime, it'd be a picnic out behind the church, and they'd all hang around and gossip about their friends. So that's why they went to church, really. Okay, now, I'm going to tell you a couple of things about the teachers, and then if you have questions and there's time, you can ask questions. Teachers in those days were usually young women. When I say young women, in the early days, they could be as young as 14.
What?
When you finished the 8th grade, you were done. No more school. When you were 14 years old in those days, you were expected to have all the responsibilities of an adult. And most of you would be full-time on the farm, okay? And you would have no choice about what you're going to do when you grew up, because you were going to be a farmer, period. That's all there was to it. So really, they didn't really need any education beyond the 8th grade, all right? Not until later on, when people specialized in things, did you need to have education beyond the 8th grade. So your teacher could be as young as 14, usually a young woman, and sometimes a young man, but rarely, and also sometimes an older man, somebody who had already worked and made enough money to retire, and now they're teaching because they're educated and they want to share that with the community. Or after 1864, lots of men who fought in the Civil War had lost arms and legs and things like that, and they couldn't be farmers anymore, so they would become teachers if they were educated. Now later on, by 1859, your teacher would be not as young as 14, but maybe 18 or 19, because teachers had to go to high school, and there wasn't a high school in every town. So sometimes you had to go away, you had to live away from home to go to high school, and you had to pay tuition. It wasn't free. Because people thought, well, what do you need high school for? They're just going to be farmers. Well, if you want to be a teacher instead of a farmer, you had to go to high school for 3 years, and then you had to go to what was called normal school. Okay? Normal school was where you learned how to teach for a year. And they called it normal school because they were trying to normalize teaching practices. All teachers would know what they were supposed to do the same way as each other. So that's why they called it normal school. So you graduate when you're about 18 or 19, and then you get a job. Okay? Now here's something interesting. When I first started teaching, I would say it took me 5 years of teaching before I really understood what I was doing. Teaching is very complicated, and a lot of people think that all you have to do is get up and say, turn to page 18, and they read it and they learn it, but that's not how it works. So these teachers would get out by the time they were 18, these young women, and women were under a lot of pressure to get married and have children. Because in those days, that's what women did. That was what they called their station in life. Their station in life was to take care of a man and have babies. That was it. And they really wanted to do this. This was the expectation. And so lots of the girls would get married by the time they were in their early 20s. And the thinking was, if you are married and you have children at home, where should you be? Home, taking care of them, right? Not, teaching part-time or teaching full-time, taking care, or asking dad to pitch in because dad just didn't pitch in because he had enough to do on the farm. So a lot of times a young lady would start teaching at 18, and by the time she's 20, she has to retire, and she got married. So the point I'm trying to make is the teachers hardly were very experienced. Most of these young teachers were not experienced. So the quality of teaching was not that great. Okay? Teachers made, in those days, they got paid by the student. they got paid per head per semester. And if I take the average amount that they got paid in Ohio and I multiply that out, they made anywhere from $150 to $200 a year.
Wow.
So teachers could not afford to live, pay rent, buy food. So you know what they used to do in the community? They used to board the teachers. That meant that each one of the families that had kids in the school would take a turn letting the teacher live with them. They would feed the teacher, they would shelter the teacher. Let me give them a high sign. 5 minutes? Okay. All right. Would you like that if a teacher came and lived with you, say, for 3 weeks?
No.
No.
Extra homework.
There you go.
Literally everyone says no.
Do you think your mom would like it?
No.
She would have to be the best cook, and the house would have to be perfectly clean, and you guys would have to behave. Do you think your dad would like having some strange young woman in the house?
No.
No. Nobody liked it. Do you think the teacher liked it?
No.
Sometimes they liked it if the mom was a good cook, but usually they didn't. Because I've read the diaries and journals of teachers from back then, and they did not like this boarding thing. Not at all. Okay? Now, let me give you a few minutes. Do you have anything you'd like to know about schooling back then? I could go on for days. Yes, sir.
Can you tell them how it was different getting in trouble back then
Yes.
versus now?
Oh, yes.
Oh, it's much worse than that.
Okay.
Oh
In
no.
those days, boys and girls, children were expected to be seen and not heard. Adults didn't really care what you had to think or what you had to say. You were kids, you weren't quite human yet. You're going to be human later on. Once you're 14, you'll start being human. That's really the way they thought. And that the way that you taught children things, like how to behave, how to cooperate, how to work hard, was the same way they used to teach animals things. And the way they used to teach animals things is if the animal did something wrong, they'd hurt the animal. Hit him with a whip, something like that. So, in school, in those days, I'll just give you a few examples here, because we could spend hours on this. Kids are so fascinated about it. If you did something wrong, or the teacher thought you were lazy and not trying hard enough, they would try to motivate you to cooperate and work hard by either hurting you physically or hurting you psychologically, by embarrassing you, by humiliating you. So just give you a few examples. I'm going to do this real quick because I've got 2 groups after
I
this.
saw your little cat back there. I wanted to have to see a dunce cat.
Yes, well, I'll get to that.
Okay.
Also, I'm just going to say real quick, my recommendation is if there's an exhibit tied up, go somewhere
Oh, yeah,
else.
we
You'll
will.
see a lot more that way. If you're talking out of turn, at school nowadays, you lose a privilege, or you might get a reward for not doing that. In those days, one of the forms of discipline was to get the talking stick, which meant after a few warnings, if you're still interrupting or talking when you're supposed to be working quietly, the teacher would take a dirty stick like this, stick it in your mouth, and tie it in there with a kerchief. It was called the talking stick. It's like a bridle, and it would be yucky, and it would be gagging on it, and everybody would be laughing at you and teasing you. Okay. And that's what they used to do. Now, a lot of times it worked. The student never talked out of turn again. But you guys have been in school long enough to know that some of your friends in your class, if they think of something, they got to say it. Okay? I'm not going to ask who those people are. I was one of those kids when I was in school. If I thought of something, I had to say it. I didn't think to myself, oh, I'm in school, I shouldn't say it. I would just say it. So I'd be wearing this thing every day. And pretty soon, I wouldn't want to come to school anymore. And in those days, you didn't have to come to school. So I quit school in the 2nd grade and never learned how to read. That's not good. That's not what we want. Another example is, let's say that, I catch one of the girls putting nail polish on during class, okay? She might have to stand in the corner here, and I would give her a couple of heavy books. I don't know what I do with my heavy books. Oh, here they are. And she'd have to balance those on her head for maybe 15 minutes, standing either facing the class, which was usually what they did, so the girl would be embarrassed. And she'd have to balance these books on her head for 15 minutes. Now, you might think that that's pretty easy,
No.
but things happen, like you might sneeze or get an itchy nose or cough, okay, or you just lean over too far, and then you have to start all over. Another 15 minutes. Sometimes the boys, usually the boys will do this, they have to hold the books out like this for 20 minutes. Now that might look easy, but I'm going to tell you, in about 3 minutes, my arms are going to start hurting. Okay? Let's say that you're having a real hard time learning. And every time I call you up to the front of the room and ask you questions in recitation, you usually don't know the answer. Okay, now, maybe you're trying pretty hard, but you just have a hard time learning things. You know, sometimes everybody has a hard time learning certain things. And so nowadays what the teacher does is they say, oh, I got to figure out a different way to teach them so they can learn it. But back then, they didn't know that people learn different ways. So the teacher would decide you weren't learning it because you weren't trying hard. You were lazy. So you might have to, if I thought you were lazy and you're studying very hard and you got a bunch of questions wrong, I might have you come up here and sit on the stool. And while you're sitting on the stool and everybody's watching, I'm calling your names. I'm saying, Obadiah, you are a lazy boy. You are just not that bright. You're stupid. And I don't think you're going to amount to anything. So you sit there and think about your miserable future. And to help you to concentrate on that, I'm going to have you wear this little hat. And I put this cone on your head. And it says dunce. Dunce means dummy. Okay? Now, if you had a hard time, say, learning how to read, and you couldn't read anytime I call on you, and you had to wear this hat 3 or 4 times a week, you're going to start to believe you really are a dummy. And if you think that you're a dummy, then you don't try hard. What's the use? This is me. See, and that's exactly what the boys and girls would do. They would laugh, and he would be humiliated. And pretty soon, probably stop coming to school, right? Because you'd say, well, what's the use? I'm dumb. I'm wasting my time in school. So,
They're all good at certain things.
so that's another thing. The
Have a seat, ladies.
the hardest thing
Have a seat.
was the
Have a seat.
spanking, the paddle, or the switch, where you get whacked on the behind. Okay? Nowadays we don't do any of those things because we all, teachers, we all got training in something called child psychology. It didn't exist then. And we understand better about children, what's good for them and what isn't. So we have better ways. And I'm sure that you all behave every day in class, right?
I think we might have to get the talking stick out there.
I like that
Thank
one.
you for coming in.
Say thank you.
Thank you for educating us.